When two immortals built to hold back hell finally meet, the galaxy holds its breath. One sits on a throne of sacrifice, the other walks through fire as judgment. Both bear corruption they refuse to surrender to, and both believe the other has already fallen. So what happens when the only two beings strong enough to contain the darkness decide one of them has to die? The Golden Throne shuddered beneath 10,000 years of accumulated strain, its machinery grinding against forces no mortal mind could comprehend. Within the throne chamber deep beneath the imperial palace, psychic circuitry forged in the dark age of technology screamed as reality itself began to tear. The Emperor of Mankind sat motionless within his ancient prison, his withered form sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily. His consciousness stretched across the Astronomican's blazing light, the warp pressed against his will like an ocean against a dam built from faith and fury. For millennia he had held. For millennia the Imperium had endured. Then the breach opened. It came without warning, without the usual premonitions that preceded warp storms or demonic incursions. A rupture in the fabric of existence itself, a wound that bled neither warp energy nor conventional matter but something else entirely. Argent radiation flooded the throne room in waves of green-gold luminescence, a frequency of power that predated humanity's fall and transcended the warp's corrupting touch. The custodian guard raised their guardian spears, their auramite armor reflecting impossible light. Tech priests monitoring the throne's sacred functions stumbled backward as their instruments registered readings beyond their capacity to measure. The rupture widened like a wound in God's own flesh, and through it came a figure wreathed in fury and silence. The Doomslayer emerged into the throne chamber with the inevitability of judgment itself. He stood 7 feet of Praetor-suited annihilation, his armor scarred by wars that had ended universes. The suit's plating bore the marks of Hell's finest weapons, scratches from daemon claws that had long since been reduced to ash, impact craters from Titangen-class weaponry that had failed to stop him. Green-argent energy pulsed through the armor's circuitry, a heartbeat of pure destructive potential synchronized with his own eternal rage. His helmet's visor glowed with that same terrible light, 2 eye slits that revealed nothing and promised everything. In his hands, he carried no weapon yet, but the chamber's atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation, as if reality itself knew that death had entered a place where only gods dared tread. Behind him, the breach began to seal, argent energy collapsing inward like a wound cauterizing itself. The warp recoiled from it, unable to touch or corrupt the dimensional scar. Within seconds, the rupture vanished completely, leaving no trace of its passage except for the intruder it had expelled into the heart of humanity's most sacred sanctum. The throne chamber fell into a silence more profound than vacuum, broken only by the throne's mechanical breathing and the faint hum of the Slayer's armor systems cycling through combat readiness protocols. Captain General Valorian Ironhand, leader of the Adeptus Custodes, stepped forward with his guardian spear leveled. His transhuman mind processed threat calculations at speeds that would have burned out a normal human synapses. This intruder registered as neither daemon nor Xenos, neither warp spawn nor mechanical abomination. The auramite sensors embedded in his armor detected only absence where psychic signatures should have been, a void in the immaterium that moved with purpose and intent. Whatever this being was, it had no place in the materium's natural order. "Identify yourself, intruder," Valorian commanded, his voice amplified by vox speakers to fill the chamber with imperial authority. "You stand in the presence of the Master of Mankind. Kneel or be destroyed." The Slayer's head turned slowly, his visor fixing upon the custodian with mechanical precision. He did not speak. He did not acknowledge the command with any gesture of recognition or defiance. He simply stood there, utterly still, a statue carved from violence and ancient purpose. Then his gaze shifted past Valorian, past the circle of golden warriors, past the tech priests and servitors and monitoring equipment, directly toward the Golden Throne itself, directly toward the Emperor. In that moment, every psychically attuned being within the Imperial Palace felt something impossible. A flash of recognition, not from the Slayer but from the Emperor himself. The Master of Mankind, whose consciousness spanned galaxies and whose psychic might held the Astronomicon burning across the void, focused a fraction of his attention upon this newcomer. Through the connection between the Emperor and his custodians, Valorian felt his master's surprise, his curiosity, and beneath it all, something that might have been concern. The Slayer took his first step forward. Immediately, 20 custodian guards moved to intercept, their movements perfectly synchronized through years of training and psychic conditioning. They formed a wall of auramite and absolute loyalty, spears lowered, shields raised. Each one could have slaughtered 1,000 mortal warriors without breaking stride. Each one had been crafted by the Emperor's own hand to be the ultimate expression of human potential wrapped in gold and purpose. They represented 10,000 years of unwavering devotion made manifest in transhuman flesh. The Slayer did not slow. His left hand moved with surgical precision, catching the first spear thrust and redirecting it with such force that the custodian holding it spun sideways, his perfect balance disrupted. Before the warrior could recover, the Slayer's right fist hammered into the Guardian's breastplate with the force of an artillery strike. Auramite crumpled. The custodian flew backward 20 feet and impacted the chamber wall hard enough to crack the blessed stone. He did not rise. The next 3 custodians attacked simultaneously, their spears thrusting toward vitals with flawless coordination. The Slayer moved between the strikes like water flowing around stones, his armor's servos silent despite the immense power they channeled. He caught one spear shaft, broke it with a twist of his wrist, and drove the shattered end into its wielder's gorget with brutal efficiency. The custodian's armor held, but the impact knocked him unconscious. The Slayer ducked under a horizontal sweep, rose inside another warrior's guard, and delivered an uppercut that lifted the transhuman off his feet and deposited him 10 feet away in an unconscious heap. No flourishes, no wasted motion. Pure, calculated violence. Valorian watched his finest warriors fall and made his decision in the space between heartbeats. This intruder was not merely powerful. He fought with the kind of precision that came from battles beyond counting, wars that had refined violence into a perfect science. Every movement served a purpose. Every strike found its mark. This was not a daemon's chaotic fury or a Xenos' alien methodology. This was something else entirely. Throne Guard, Formation Auric, Valorian commanded, and the chamber erupted into coordinated action. 30 custodians advanced in a pattern perfected over millennia, their movements creating overlapping fields of fire and mutually supporting positions. They attacked, not as individuals, but as a single organism of gold and death, their spears weaving a net of blessed auramite that should have been impossible to penetrate. Behind them, tech priests activated the throne chamber's defensive systems. Automated turrets descended from the ceiling, their targeting spirits locked onto the intruder. Conversion fields flickered to life, creating shimmering barriers between the Slayer and the throne itself. The Slayer reached to his back and drew the super shotgun. The weapon was impossibly ancient, its mechanisms predating Old Night itself. Blessed by angels and drenched in demon blood, it had ended titans and shattered reality across 100 dimensions. The Slayer loaded 2 shells with movements worn smooth by eternal repetition, the action producing a sound like the chambering of apocalypse. He raised the weapon, and even the custodians, who knew no fear, felt something primal stir in their enhanced minds. He fired. The blast was not merely kinetic force. Argent energy wrapped around the projectiles, supercharging them with the same power that had annihilated Hell's armies across infinite battlefields. The first shell struck a custodian's storm shield and detonated with such force that the conversion field collapsed, the shield shattered, and the warrior behind it was hurled backward through 3 of his brothers. The second shell found the gap in their formation and struck a support pillar, turning a section of blessed stone into molten slag that splashed across the floor in hissing streams. The Slayer advanced into the chaos he had created. His movements became a blur of green-lit destruction as he holstered the shotgun and drew the crucible from his back. The blade ignited with a sound like reality screaming, argent plasma contained in the shape of judgment itself. 7 feet of burning righteousness cut through the air, and where it passed, auramite parted like silk. The Slayer swept the blade in a horizontal arc that forced 6 custodians to throw themselves backward or be bisected. He reversed his grip, drove the point downward through a warrior's pauldron and into the stone beneath, pinning him in place without killing him. Released the blade, drew his plasma rifle, fired 3 shots in different directions with impossible accuracy. Each blast found its mark. Each custodian fell. Valorian moved then, his centuries of experience crystallizing into action. He activated his Guardian Spear's energy field to maximum output, channeling his own psychic resonance through the weapon's blessed mechanisms. The blade burned with golden fire, a fragment of the Emperor's own power made manifest through his greatest warrior. He charged with speed that made him a blur even to his transhuman brothers, closing the distance to the Slayer in a fraction of a second. Their weapons met with a crack that shook the throne chamber's foundations. Argent green clashed against imperial gold, 2 forces of absolute conviction locked in a test of wills made physical. Valorian pressed forward with strength that could have crushed an armored vehicle, his every muscle fiber augmented beyond human possibility. The Slayer held his ground without visible effort, his armor's systems absorbing and redistributing the impact through channels designed by angel science. They stood locked together for a moment that stretched, neither giving ground, neither showing weakness. Then the Slayer moved. He released the crucible with his right hand, letting it fall, and caught it with his left in a reverse grip. Simultaneously, his right hand shot forward and grabbed Valorian's gorget with fingers that could crush ceramite. The custodian captain reacted instantly, releasing his spear and attempting a grappling maneuver that should have broken the hold. The Slayer simply lifted him off his feet as if he weighed nothing and hurled him toward the nearest wall. Valorian twisted in midair with cat-like grace, his armor's gravitics activating to slow his impact. He hit the wall boots first and launched himself back toward the Slayer with redoubled fury. They collided again, and this time it was pure close-quarters brutality. Valorian's fists hammered into the Slayer's armor with strikes that would have demolished a lemon rust tank. The Slayer absorbed each blow, his Praetor suit's systems reading the impacts and adjusting his counter-strikes accordingly. He drove his knee into Valorian's midsection, followed with an elbow to the helmet, and finished with a palm strike that sent the Captain General sliding backward across the chamber floor. Valorian recovered instantly, but blood ran from his nose inside his helmet, the first injury he had sustained in nearly a century. The remaining custodians attacked from all sides, abandoning formation for overwhelming force. Spears thrust from every angle. Guardian axes descended in killing arcs. Sentinel blades sought the gaps in the Slayer's armor. He moved through their attacks like a dancer through rain, each motion precise, each counterstrike devastating. He grabbed one warrior's wrist, twisted, and used the custodian's own momentum to throw him into 2 others. Ducked under a spear thrust, rose inside another's guard, head-butted him hard enough to dent Auramite. Spun low, his legs sweeping out to take 3 warriors off their feet simultaneously. He was not trying to kill them, he was trying to reach the throne. This realization struck Valorian with the force of revelation. Every movement the Slayer made, every counter and strike and redirection, aimed him toward the Emperor. He fought through the custodians not with hatred but with purpose, treating them not as enemies but as obstacles. His violence held no rage directed at the Golden Warriors, only an absolute determination to fulfill whatever mission drove him. In that moment, Valorian understood that he was not facing a daemon or a madman, but a warrior who served a purpose he deemed sacred, a warrior who believed the Emperor was his target. "He comes for the master of mankind," Valorian transmitted across the custodian Vox network. "All units converge. He must not reach the throne." But they were too late. The Slayer had already crossed half the chamber, leaving a trail of unconscious custodians in his wake. He bounded over a fallen guardian, caught himself on a support column, and launched himself toward the throne's first tier with explosive force. Automated defenses activated, las beams and plasma bolts converging on his position. He twisted in midair, his armor's systems calculating trajectories and adjusting his trajectory with microbursts from his jump pack. Most of the shots missed. Those that hit glanced off his praetor suit's shielding, absorbed by technology that had survived worse than anything the Imperium could muster. He landed on the throne's third tier, 30 feet from the Emperor himself. Here, the very air grew heavy with psychic pressure. The Emperor's presence pressed against reality like a mountain pressing against the sky, his consciousness so vast that merely being near him could burn out unprotected minds. Psychic circuitry embedded in every surface hummed with power beyond mortal comprehension, channeling energies that held the Astronomicon burning and kept the webway breach sealed beneath the palace. To stand here was to stand at the nexus of humanity's survival, the point where one being's will held back the warp's infinite hunger. The Slayer drew his ballista and fired directly at the golden throne. Arcing tendrils of argent lightning leaped from the weapon, each one carrying enough power to vaporize a squad of space marines. They struck the conversion fields, protecting the throne, and detonated in spectacular bursts of green and gold. Warning klaxons blared. Tech priests screamed alerts in binary cant. The throne's systems, already strained by millennia of constant operation, registered fluctuations that threatened catastrophic failure. For a moment, just a moment, the barrier weakened. The Slayer surged forward into the gap. He made it 5 steps before the Emperor intervened. Not physically. The master of mankind had not moved from his throne in 10,000 years, his body too damaged, too fragile, too necessary to risk. But his mind was another matter entirely. His psychic might, normally focused on the Astronomicon and the eternal battle within the webway, turned its attention fully upon the intruder. The weight of that attention would have crushed a demon prince to nothing. It would have burned out 1,000 psychers simultaneously. It would have shattered a titan's machine spirit. The Slayer felt it and did not break. His mind, forged in hell's crucibles and tempered by the divinity machine, possessed a resilience that defied warp logic. Where others would have burned or broken or simply ceased to exist, the Slayer pushed forward against the Emperor's psychic pressure with the same determination he had shown against every impossible obstacle. His armor's argent systems flared brighter, ancient maker technology interacting with the praetor suit's mechanisms to create a field that insulated his consciousness from the warp's touch. He was not immune to psychic power, but he was resistant in ways that no mortal should have been. He took another step toward the throne. The Emperor's attention sharpened, and suddenly the Slayer was not facing pressure but presence. A consciousness vast beyond measure focused upon him with the full weight of its curiosity and concern. In that moment of contact, 2 beings who stood outside normal existence touched minds across the gulf that separated their purposes. The Emperor, who had walked terror since before recorded history, whose plans encompassed millennia and whose sacrifices had saved humanity from extinction. The Doomslayer, who had fought across hell and dimensions beyond counting, whose rage had ended demonic empires, and whose purpose was written in blood and fire. They saw each other, truly saw each other, and understanding dawned with terrible clarity. The Emperor recognized what the Slayer was seeking. Beneath the psychic might and the imperial authority and the weight of 10,000 years, he felt something familiar, a taint, a corruption so deeply woven into his essence that even he could barely perceive it. The Chaos Gods had touched him during his imprisonment on the throne, their influence seeping through the barriers he maintained, poisoning his purpose even as he fought to preserve humanity. They had not corrupted him entirely, could never corrupt him entirely, but they had left their mark. A shadow on the sun, a whisper in the light. The Slayer had sensed that corruption the moment he entered the throne chamber. To his senses, honed by battles against demons across infinite realities, the Emperor read as a being who harbored demonic essence, not willingly, not completely, but enough to mark him as a target, enough to trigger the Slayer's purpose, that singular drive to destroy anything touched by hell's influence, no matter how great, how powerful, or how necessary its existence might be. The Emperor understood then that this intruder meant to kill him, not out of malice, not out of madness, but because the Slayer perceived him as compromised, as a threat that needed to be eliminated before it could spread its corruption further. The logic was terrifying in its simplicity. The determination behind it was absolute, and the Emperor could not allow it. He released a fraction of his power, and the throne chamber erupted into golden fire. Psychic lightning arced from every surface, transforming the sanctum into a storm of divine wrath. The Slayer's argent shielding flared, absorbing and deflecting attacks that would have unmade lesser beings. He fired the ballista again, sending arcing energy toward the throne's core systems. The Emperor's will manifested as geometric patterns of light that intercepted the blast mid-flight, containing and dispersing its power harmlessly. The two forces clashed, argent green against psychic gold, technology beyond ancient against power beyond mortal. The custodians used the distraction to regroup. Valorian rallied those who could still fight, forming a final defensive line before the throne itself. They had failed to stop the intruder from reaching this point, but they would die before allowing him to strike at their master. Behind them, tech priests worked frantically to stabilize the throne's systems, their augmented fingers flying across control panels as warning indicators blazed red across 100 monitoring stations. The Slayer holstered the ballista and drew the BFG 9000. The weapon emerged from his back with a sound like worlds dying, its core already beginning to spin up for maximum charge. Green-argent plasma gathered in the firing chamber, building to critical mass. This weapon had destroyed Titangent-class demons with single shots. It had cleared entire battlefield sectors of demonic infestation. It had punched holes through reality itself when fired at maximum power. And now the Slayer aimed it directly at the Golden Throne, his finger on the trigger, his purpose absolute. "Wait," Valorian commanded, though he did not know if the intruder could understand Gothic or cared to listen. "You do not understand what you threaten. If the Emperor falls, humanity falls with him. The Astronomicon will fail. The warp will consume Terra. Billions will die. Trillions across the galaxy will be lost in the Immaterium's madness. Whatever corruption you sense, whatever taint you perceive, his existence is all that holds the darkness at bay." The Slayer's finger tightened on the trigger. Then the Emperor spoke, not with words, for his body was too damaged for speech. Not through the warp, for that would have destroyed every unprotected mind in the palace. He spoke directly into the Slayer's consciousness, bypassing argent shielding and dimensional barriers through sheer psychic authority. His voice was the sound of thunder rolling across ancient mountains, the crash of oceans against primordial shores, the whisper of a father to a lost son. "Stop." The single word carried more weight than 1,000 sermons. It held the accumulated authority of a being who had shaped civilizations and destroyed empires, who had bargained with gods and defied fate itself. It held understanding, recognition, and something that might have been respect. The Emperor was not commanding the Slayer to stop. He was asking. The Slayer did not fire, but neither did he lower the weapon. "I know what you sense within me," the Emperor continued, his psychic voice resonating through the Slayer's mind with perfect clarity. "You perceive corruption, taint from the entities you have dedicated your existence to destroying. You are correct. The Chaos Gods have touched me through my imprisonment on this throne. Their poison seeps through cracks I cannot fully seal while maintaining humanity's survival. You see this and judge me compromised, a threat that must be eliminated." The BFG's charging cycle reached maximum power, its core thrumming with enough energy to vaporize a city block. "But consider this, warrior. I am not merely fighting corruption within myself. I am the cage that contains it. I am the dam that holds back an ocean of madness. If you destroy me to eliminate the taint, you will unleash devastation beyond measure. Not because I shelter the enemy, but because my existence prevents their total victory. The corruption you sense is not my essence. It is my burden." Images flooded the Slayer's mind, not forced upon him but offered for his consideration. The webway breach beneath the palace, where daemons pressed against barriers maintained by the Emperor's constant vigilance. The Astronomicon, its light keeping billions of human souls from being lost in warp transit. The pylons scattered across the galaxy, their networks subtly reinforced by the Emperor's psychic touch. The countless battles fought within the Immaterium itself, where the Emperor's consciousness waged war against the Chaos Gods on a battlefield of pure thought and will, and beneath it all, the truth that even the Emperor's finest servants did not fully comprehend. He was not merely holding back the darkness, he was actively fighting it, using himself as both weapon and shield. The corruption the Slayer sensed was the result of that battle. Wounds sustained from constant exposure to forces that sought to consume him entirely. He bore the taint because holding it within himself prevented it from spreading to humanity itself. He was not a demon to be destroyed, he was a warrior standing against demons, just as the Slayer was. The Slayer's enhanced mind processed this information with the same precision he applied to combat calculations. The Emperor's argument held logical weight. Killing a corrupted being served no purpose if that being's death caused greater harm than its continued existence. He had learned this lesson in dimensions where his fury had created power vacuums that demons rushed to fill. Purity of purpose was meaningless if it led to worse outcomes, but the Slayer also knew what corruption could do when left unchecked. He had seen how small taints grew into overwhelming infestations. He had watched beings who believed themselves strong enough to contain evil gradually succumb to it. The Emperor's power was vast, yes, but even the mightiest dam eventually cracked under sufficient pressure. How long before the master of mankind fell completely to the taint he harbored? How many would die when that happened? The conflict crystallized into a single question. Was the Emperor strong enough to continue holding? Show me. The Slayer's thought resonated back, not words but intent made clear through the psychic connection. The Emperor understood immediately. He was being challenged to prove his strength, to demonstrate that the corruption within him remained contained and controlled. It was a test, brutal in its simplicity. The Slayer would judge the Emperor not by his words or his servant's faith, but by his actions, by his ability to withstand a force that existed to destroy corruption regardless of collateral damage. The Emperor accepted the challenge. Then come, warrior. His psychic voice carried the weight of resignation and anticipation alike. Test my strength. Prove to yourself whether I am worthy to continue bearing this burden or whether I have become the very thing you exist to destroy. But know this, if you truly believe me fallen, if you judge me beyond redemption, then do what you must. I will not beg for mercy. I will only fight to prove I deserve to stand. The Slayer lowered the BFG and returned it to his back. If he was going to test the Emperor's strength, he would do it properly. Not at range with overwhelming firepower, but up close, where he could sense the extent of the corruption directly, where he could judge not just the Emperor's power but his control, his purity of purpose wrapped in tainted flesh. He needed to fight the master of mankind hand to hand, consciousness to consciousness, to determine whether the being before him was still human enough to deserve continued existence. He drew the crucible once more, its argent blade igniting with renewed fury. Custodians, stand down. The Emperor commanded through the psychic link he shared with his guardians. This battle is mine alone to fight. Master, no. Valorian protested even as his body obeyed the command reflexively. You cannot risk yourself. If you fall, all is lost. If I fall to this warrior's judgment, then I was already lost, the Emperor replied. He tests not my power but my worthiness. Such tests are necessary, for even I must prove that the burden I bear has not consumed me entirely. You will bear witness, my custodian. Watch carefully. If I fail, if the corruption proves stronger than my will, then assist him in ending me quickly. Humanity will find another way. The command struck the custodians like a physical blow. To watch their master fight alone, to be ordered to help end his existence if he failed. It violated every instinct they possessed, every purpose for which they had been created. But they obeyed, for the Emperor's will was absolute, and they trusted his judgment even when it demanded the impossible. The Slayer approached the golden throne, his armored boots ringing against the blessed metal of the chamber floor. Each step brought him closer to the heart of humanity's imperium, to the being who sat at the center of the galaxy's most powerful empire. The psychic pressure increased with each meter, building until normal humans would have been crushed flat by its weight. But the Slayer had walked through Hell's highest towers. He had faced demon lords whose mere presence warped reality. This pressure, intense as it was, remained within parameters he could endure. He reached the throne's base and looked up at the Emperor's withered form. 10,000 years of constant psychic exertion had reduced the master of mankind to a skeletal figure barely recognizable as human. His flesh had become parchment stretched over ancient bones. His features had sunken into a death mask that no longer fully resembled the face that had once united terror. Only his eyes remained vital, burning with golden light that held back the darkness through sheer force of will. Those eyes met the Slayer's visor, and in that moment, understanding passed between them once more. Two warriors, each dedicated to humanity's survival through different paths, each bearing burdens that would have destroyed lesser beings. Each standing at a crossroads where their purposes aligned and clashed simultaneously. They were not enemies, yet they could not be allies. Not yet. Not until this test resolved. The Emperor began to move. It should have been impossible. His body was too damaged, too fragile, sustained only by the throne's life support systems and the sacrifice of countless psychers. Yet psychic power could accomplish what flesh could not. Golden energy wreathed the Emperor's form, lifting him from the throne in defiance of physical limitation. The machinery screamed in protest, warning klaxons blaring as the master of mankind separated himself from the systems that kept him alive. He had perhaps minutes before his body failed completely, before the separation killed him regardless of the battle's outcome. He intended to use those minutes well. The Emperor's psychic form manifested fully, a towering figure of gold and light that dwarfed even the Slayer's enhanced stature. This was how he had appeared during the Great Crusade, before the heresy, before the throne. 12 feet of perfected humanity wrapped in radiant authority, every muscle carved from purpose, every feature reflecting the absolute pinnacle of what humankind could become. He wore golden armor that seemed to be part of his flesh, and in his hands he wielded a flaming sword that burned with the light of dying stars. This was the Emperor as he wished to be remembered, as he still saw himself, as he might yet become if he survived long enough to escape his imprisonment. The Slayer charged without hesitation. His crucible swept toward the Emperor's midsection in a cut designed to bisect lesser opponents. The Emperor's sword intercepted it, and where the blades met, reality screamed. Argent energy clashed against psychic fire, two forces that should not have been able to touch, creating cascading waves of power that rippled through the throne chamber. Tech priests dove for cover as their instruments exploded. Custodians raised their storm shields as shrapnel and energy wash threatened to overwhelm even their auramite protection. The Slayer pressed his attack, his movements a perfect synthesis of rage and precision. He struck high, low, center, each blow delivered with force that could shatter fortress walls. The Emperor parried every strike, his sword moving with inhuman speed. His transhuman reflexes pushed beyond their limits by psychic augmentation. They fought across the chamber floor in a dance of destruction, their weapons leaving glowing trails in the air, their impacts sending shockwaves through blessed stone. Neither spoke. Speech was unnecessary for this level of combat. Every strike carried intent. Every parry contained judgment. They communicated through violence, expressing questions and answers in the language of war. The Slayer tested the Emperor's speed, his strength, his reaction time. The Emperor demonstrated his continued mastery of combat, his ability to predict and counter threats, his refusal to yield ground even when facing an opponent who had ended armies. They broke apart, circled, engaged again with redoubled intensity. The Emperor struck first this time, his flaming sword descending in an overhead arc that would have split a land raider in half. The Slayer rolled aside, came up inside the Emperor's guard, and drove his shoulder into the golden armor with enough force to stagger a titan. The Emperor absorbed the impact, wrapped his free hand around the Slayer's gorget, and hurled him across the chamber with strength that belied his ancient form. The Slayer crashed through a support pillar, the blessed stone shattering around him. He rose from the debris without pause and launched himself back into the fight. The battle intensified, both warriors pushing beyond the limits of what should have been possible. The Slayer activated his Praetor suit's advanced mobility systems, moving with blinding speed, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. The Emperor matched him through psychic enhancement, his consciousness predicting trajectories before the Slayer completed them, his sword intercepting blows that should have been too fast to see. They fought on the ground, on the walls, across the ceiling as gravitic forces warped beneath their fury. And throughout it all, the Slayer sensed the corruption within the Emperor's being. It pulsed like a tumor at the core of golden light, chaos taint wrapped in layers of psychic discipline, but he also sensed the Emperor's control over it, the iron will that prevented the taint from spreading, the constant internal battle that accompanied the external fight. The corruption was there, undeniable and real, but it remained contained, held in check by determination that rivaled the Slayer's own. The Emperor was not losing his internal war. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, if his will held. But will was not enough for the Slayer's judgment. He needed to see what happened when that will was pushed to its absolute limit. When the Emperor faced a threat that could actually kill him, would the corruption seize that moment to break free? Would the chaos taint surge forth in a last desperate attempt to preserve itself? Or would the Emperor's control hold even in the face of death? The Slayer switched tactics abruptly. He dismissed the crucible, letting it vanish into his armor's dimensional storage, and drew his fists. The combat became close-quarters brutality, fist against psychic force, armor against augmented flesh. He hammered blow after blow into the Emperor's guard, testing not the master of mankind's technique, but his endurance, his ability to maintain focus under sustained assault, his capacity to prevent the corruption from exploiting any lapse in concentration. The Emperor met the challenge without flinching. His golden fists struck back with comet force, each impact ringing against the Slayer's Praetor suit like thunder. They grappled in the center of the throne chamber, two forces of absolute conviction locked in a test of pure physical might. The floor cracked beneath their feet. The air itself seemed to warp from the pressure of their struggle. Custodians watched in horrified awe as their master, who had not left the throne in 10 millennia, fought with the vigor of his prime. Then the Emperor's body began to fail. The separation from the throne's life support systems was taking its toll. The golden psychic form flickered, showing glimpses of the withered flesh beneath. Blood ran from the Emperor's mouth, his ancient body breaking down under the strain of combat it was never meant to endure. He staggered, his perfect defense wavering for just a moment. The corruption pulsed, sensing weakness, seeking an opportunity to break free. The Slayer struck with everything he had. His fist hammered into the Emperor's chest with such force that the psychic form shattered entirely, revealing the frail body beneath. The master of mankind flew backward, crashed into the golden throne, and slumped against its machinery. Blood stained his golden armor. His breathing came in ragged gasps. His body was failing, dying, mere seconds from complete shutdown. The corruption surged within him, chaos energies sensing imminent death and attempting to seize control of his vast psychic might for one final act of destruction. And the Emperor crushed it. With his last reserves of strength, with will forged across 30,000 years of struggle, he forced the corruption back into containment, not through power, though his power remained vast even in his dying moments. Through pure determination, through refusal to yield even a fraction of his purpose to the enemy. The chaos taint retreated, locked down, sealed away by mental disciplines that would have shattered normal minds. The Emperor maintained control until the very edge of death, and even then he did not break. The Slayer saw this and understood. The corruption existed, yes, but it remained a prisoner, not a jailer. The Emperor was strong enough, disciplined enough, to bear the burden indefinitely. He would die before letting it control him. He would fight eternally before surrendering to the taint. His will was sufficient to the task he had set himself. The judgment was rendered. The Emperor deserved to stand. The Slayer reached down and lifted the Emperor's broken body with surprising gentleness. He carried the master of mankind back to the golden throne and carefully positioned him within the life support systems. Tech priests rushed forward, their augmented hands flying across control panels as they re-established the connections that kept their master alive. Warning klaxons gradually fell silent. Vital signs stabilized. The Emperor's consciousness, which had nearly fragmented entirely, began to reintegrate with the throne's vast systems. Through the psychic link they still shared, the Emperor's voice reached the Slayer one final time. "You have seen the truth of my burden, warrior. You understand now that I fight not because I am free from corruption, but because I refuse to surrender to it. This is the war we wage, those of us who stand between humanity and the darkness. We cannot avoid contamination. We can only resist it with every fiber of our being until our duty is fulfilled or we fall in the attempt." The Slayer nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of understanding. He knew this truth intimately. He had walked through hell itself, had been bathed in demon blood and wreathed in balefire. He carried his own contamination, his own burden of exposure to forces that sought to twist him, but he endured through sheer force of will, just as the Emperor did. They were not so different, these two warriors separated by dimension and purpose. "Will you continue your mission?" the Emperor asked. "Will you seek out and destroy the sources of corruption within my Imperium? There are many who have fallen further than I have, who lack the strength to resist. They would benefit from your judgment. They need what you provide." The Slayer considered this. His presence in this dimension had been accidental, the result of a breach between realities that he had not created or controlled. He had no mission here, no purpose beyond the instinctive response to perceived demonic taint. But the Emperor's question offered him one. The Imperium was vast, and within its borders, corruption festered in countless forms. Chaos cults, fallen space marines, possessed worlds. If he remained in this dimension, he would find no shortage of targets worthy of his fury. But something pulled at him, a sensation he recognized from previous dimensional breaches. The argent energy that had brought him here was beginning to destabilize, reality attempting to correct the anomaly of his presence. He had perhaps hours before the dimensional membrane ejected him back to wherever his path led next. Not enough time to wage the kind of campaign the Emperor suggested, only enough time to address immediate threats. "I will hunt what corruption I can find before the breach closes." The Slayer's thought resonated through the connection. "But I will not remain. My war exists across many dimensions, against enemies beyond your borders. The corruption here is yours to fight. You have proven yourself worthy of that burden. Then take this before you go," the Emperor replied, and golden light suffused the Slayer's consciousness. Information flooded his enhanced mind, locations and coordinates across Terra where corruption had taken root. Hidden cult sanctuaries, possessed government officials, zones where the warp's influence had grown too strong, targets that the Imperium knew about but had not yet mustered the resources to address. "These are my final gifts to you, warrior. Hunt well. Make them fear the sound of your footsteps. Remind them that even in a galaxy of darkness, judgment still walks." The psychic connection severed as the Emperor's consciousness returned fully to maintaining the Astronomicon. The Slayer stood before the golden throne for a moment longer, his visor regarding the withered form that housed such indomitable will. Then he turned and walked toward the throne chamber's exit. Custodians parted before him, no longer seeing him as an intruder but as something else, a warrior who had tested their master and found him worthy. An ally, perhaps, or at least not an enemy. Valorian stepped forward as the Slayer passed. "What are you?" the Captain General asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity beneath its martial tone. "What manner of being fights as you do? Judges as you do?" The Slayer paused, considering the question. Then he reached up and removed his helmet. The face beneath was human, or had been once. Scars covered skin that had been burned and healed countless times. His eyes held the weight of wars beyond counting, a depth of experience that made even the ancient custodian feel young. But despite the damage, despite the obvious augmentation, despite everything he had become, the humanity remained. He was not a demon, not a Xenos, not a machine intelligence, just a man who had transcended mortal limits through rage and purpose and absolute refusal to yield. "I am what becomes of those who fight demons long enough," the Slayer replied, his voice carrying the rasp of disuse. He spoke rarely, his purpose expressed through action rather than words. But Valorian deserved an answer, and the Emperor's custodians deserved to understand what had tested their master. I am judgment rendered in flesh and fury. I am the answer to corruption's question. I am what humanity can become when it stops asking for mercy and starts demanding justice. He replaced his helmet, sealing himself once more behind the visor's emotionless gaze. Tell your Emperor this, the Slayer continued. The corruption will never stop testing him. It will press against his defenses every moment of every day for as long as he lives. It will seek weakness in every thought, every decision, every sacrifice he makes. If he ever falters, if the burden ever grows too heavy, he will fall. But I have walked through hell's deepest circles and faced its most powerful demons. None of them possessed will as strong as what I witnessed today. If his purpose holds, the corruption will break before he does. Then the Slayer walked out of the throne chamber, leaving golden warriors to contemplate his words and tend to their master. He had judgment to render elsewhere, targets to destroy before the dimensional breach sealed and carried him away to whatever war awaited next. The Emperor's gift of corruption locations burned in his mind like waypoints on a map of damnation, each one a promise of violence fulfilled, of justice delivered to those who thought themselves safe in their depravity. He emerged into the Imperial Palace's vast corridors, and immediately alarms began to wail. Word of his presence had spread through the palace's communication networks, security forces mobilized, converging on his position with orders to contain or destroy the intruder who had somehow penetrated to the Golden Throne itself. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of lesser custodians, entire companies of palace guard, armed with the finest weapons the Imperium could provide. They thought their numbers and firepower would be sufficient. They were wrong. The Slayer checked the first coordinates the Emperor had provided and began walking toward the palace's commercial districts. Somewhere in those crowded streets and massive hab blocks, a chaos cult had established its sanctuary. They believed themselves hidden, protected by carefully maintained anonymity and the sheer scale of Terra's population. They believed they could spread their corruption slowly, carefully, until the moment came to strike at the Imperium's heart. The Slayer would correct that belief, permanently. He walked through the palace corridors with steady purpose, and behind him, security forces scrambled to respond. Squad after squad engaged him, their lasguns and bolters filling the air with destructive fury. He moved through their fire with practiced ease, his armor's systems absorbing impacts that would have killed lesser warriors. When they blocked his path entirely, he simply walked through them, through their barricades, through their formations, through their desperate final stands. He did not kill unnecessarily, merely removed them from his path with enough force to ensure they stayed down. But some tried too hard to stop him. Some pressed their attack beyond the point of reasonable resistance. These he marked as potentially corrupted, their excessive dedication suggesting influence beyond normal loyalty. He stored their identities in his armor's memory systems, adding them to the list of targets that deserved deeper investigation. If they proved innocent, they would simply recover from their injuries and return to duty. If they proved tainted, they would receive the judgment they had earned. He reached the palace's outer levels and descended into the commercial sectors. Here, Terra's population lived in layers of hab blocks that stretched for miles in every direction, cities stacked atop cities in the fashion of a hive world. Billions of humans crammed into spaces never meant to hold them, sustained by infrastructure that ran on prayers and desperation, the perfect environment for corruption to take root, for chaos cults to recruit from the desperate and the damned. The Slayer's enhanced senses pierced through the crowds and the noise, following the trail the Emperor had provided. It led him deep into the lower levels, where the sun never reached, and the only light came from flickering lumen strips. Here, in chambers carved from Terra's ancient stone, the cult had established its sanctuary. Here, they performed their rituals and offered their prayers to powers that promised freedom from the Imperium's grinding oppression. He found their entrance hidden behind a false wall in an abandoned manufactorum. The door had been warded with psychic seals meant to deflect attention, to make observers want to look elsewhere. These wards meant nothing to the Slayer's Praetor suit, its sensors registering the seals as easily as normal humans registered color. He placed his hand against the door and pushed. The seals shattered. The door crumpled inward. Alarms began to sound within the cult's sanctuary. The Slayer entered, and judgment entered with him. The sanctuary was larger than expected, carved from Terra's bedrock into a cathedral of corruption. Unholy symbols decorated the walls, written in languages that preceded human civilization. Altars stained with blood stood at intervals, their surfaces worn smooth by millennia of sacrifice. Cultists scrambled to respond to the intrusion, their robes bearing the marks of the chaos god they served. These were not recently corrupted innocents. These were dedicated servants who had spent years building their power base in Terra's shadows. They attacked with weapons both mundane and sorcerous. Autoguns barked in the darkness. Psychers hurled bolts of warp energy that sizzled against the Slayer's argent shielding. Possessed cultists charged with strength beyond mortal limits, their flesh warped by demonic influence. The Slayer met them all with the same surgical precision he had demonstrated against the custodians. He moved through their ranks like death itself, his weapons selecting appropriate targets with mechanical efficiency. The cultists fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Those who tried to flee found their escape routes blocked by a warrior who moved faster than they could run. Those who tried to hide discovered that Argent-enhanced sensors could detect corruption through solid stone. Those who tried to fight learned the futility of mortal strength against a being who had walked through Hell's armies. Within minutes, the sanctuary fell silent, except for the sound of the Slayer's boots against blood-slicked stone. He found the cult's leader kneeling before the central altar, his hands raised in desperate prayer to the Chaos God, whose favor he had cultivated for decades. Warp energy gathered around the cult leader's form, building toward a final curse meant to bring down the sanctuary and everyone in it. Better to die serving his dark master than to fall to whatever force had destroyed his cult so easily. The corruption pulsed within him, strong enough to register as a beacon to any warp-sensitive being in the sector. The Slayer drew his super shotgun and fired once. The blast obliterated the cult leader entirely, scattering his corrupted essence across the altar he had served. The warp energy he had been gathering dissipated harmlessly, unable to maintain coherence without its focal point. The Slayer holstered his weapon and turned to examine the sanctuary's structure. This place had been used for corruption too long. Its very stones had absorbed taint that would persist even if every surface was scoured clean. He drew a primed explosive from his armor's storage and set it at the sanctuary's main support column. The device was not of Imperial manufacture, its mechanisms built from technologies predating human spaceflight. But its purpose was universal: create focused destruction, ensure total cleansing, leave nothing that could be recovered or repurposed by corruption servants. The explosive's timer began counting down from 30 seconds. The Slayer departed the sanctuary, ascending through the levels with the same steady purpose he had shown entering. Behind him, the explosive detonated with precisely calculated force. The sanctuary collapsed, its chambers imploding under carefully directed kinetic energy. Stone crushed stone until nothing remained except rubble too thoroughly destroyed to contain any lingering taint. The collapse was clean, contained, inflicting no damage beyond the corruption's nest itself. He checked the next coordinates. Another cult, this one hidden within a government administrative complex. The Emperor's intelligence had marked it as recently established, its members drawn from mid-level bureaucrats who had been corrupted through slow exposure to chaos texts disguised as efficiency reports. They thought themselves subtle, their corruption too new to register on the Imperium's detection systems. They thought they had time to grow their influence before anyone noticed. They were wrong about that too. The Slayer crossed the commercial sector at speed now, no longer bothering with stealth or subtlety. Word of his rampage had spread through Terra's communication networks. His description circulated among military units and law enforcement agencies. Some tried to intercept him. Some tried to evacuate civilians from his path. Most simply stayed out of his way, their survival instincts overwhelming their duty to investigate unauthorized violence. They could not stop him. They would not stop him. All they could do was watch as he carved a path through Terra's underworld toward his next target. He reached the administrative complex and ascended its exterior, his armor's systems allowing him to scale the building's surface as easily as walking on level ground. He entered through a window on the 73rd floor, shattering reinforced glass with a single punch. Alarms wailed, security forces mobilized. The cultists within sensed his approach and began activating the defensive measures they had prepared against exactly this scenario. None of it mattered. The Slayer moved through the complex like a force of nature, unstoppable and inexorable. He cleared room after room, identifying corrupted individuals with precision that left no doubt about their guilt. These he eliminated without hesitation. Innocent workers he ignored, stepping past them without violence unless they actively impeded his progress. Within 20 minutes, the cult was destroyed, its members scattered across the complex in poses of violent death. He set another explosive at the nexus of the cult's ritual space, a conference room where they had drawn profane symbols beneath the carpet and hidden chaos texts within false data slates. The explosive detonated as he exited the building, incinerating everything within a 50-foot radius. Fire suppression systems activated automatically, containing the damage before it could spread. The complex would recover. The corruption would not. Third target. A cell of heretical tech priests who had discovered archaeotech that predated the dark age of technology and interpreted its functions through the lens of chaos worship. They believed the ancient machines contained the keys to transcendence, gateways to realms where flesh and metal merged into something greater than human. They were half right. The machines did contain gateways, but what waited beyond those gateways was not transcendence. It was enslavement. The Slayer found their workshop deep beneath the palace's foundation, in caverns that had been sealed since before the Imperium's founding. The tech priests had breached the seals carefully, preserving the ancient machines within while establishing their own research stations around them. Their work had progressed far enough to be dangerous, but not far enough to achieve whatever goal they sought. Perfect timing for intervention. He descended into the caverns through maintenance shafts that had not been accessed in millennia. The tech priests detected his approach through their sensor networks, but they interpreted his readings as corrupted data. Nothing in their experience prepared them for what the Slayer represented. Transhuman warriors they understood, daemons they had studied, but a being who registered as neither, whose armor systems operated on principles their knowledge could not catalogue, whose very presence seemed to defy the Omnissiah's laws. They tried to rationalize what approached them until the moment he entered their workshop. Then rationalization became impossible. The Slayer emerged from the darkness with his crucible already ignited, its argent blade cutting through shadows older than human history. The corrupted tech priests attempted to defend themselves with their augmented forms and forbidden technologies. They had replaced significant portions of their flesh with machinery designed to channel warp energies, creating hybrid forms that pulsed with demonic influence. These augmentations gave them strength and resilience beyond normal tech priests, but they remained insufficient. The Slayer dismantled them with methodical efficiency. His crucible sheared through their mechanical components as easily as their corrupted flesh. When they tried to use their archaeotech weapons against him, he closed the distance before they could properly target him. When they attempted to activate the ancient machines as a final desperate measure, he reached the control systems first and input commands that shut everything down. The machines fell silent, their potential for corruption neutralized by someone who understood their function better than those who had tried to exploit them. He examined the archaeotech carefully. Some of it was salvageable, its core purposes aligned with genuine scientific inquiry rather than chaos worship. These machines he left intact, their systems locked with protocols only the Mechanicus's highest authorities could break. But several devices showed signs of irreversible taint, their mechanisms twisted by exposure to warp energies until their original functions had been subsumed by corruption. These he destroyed completely, reducing them to slag with focused applications of argent energy. The explosive he left behind was larger this time, sufficient to collapse the entire cavern system. The ancient machines would be buried under millions of tons of stone, preserved against future exploitation but removed from easy access. Perhaps millennia from now, when the Imperium had developed better defenses against corruption, someone would unearth them again and learn their secrets properly. Until then, they they would sleep in Terra's depths where they could harm no one. He ascended from the caverns and checked the time. Hours had passed since his arrival in the throne chamber. The dimensional breach was beginning to close, reality preparing to eject his disruptive presence back to wherever the currents between worlds would carry him. He had perhaps one more target before the transition became inevitable. The Emperor's gift of locations had included dozens of corruption sites, but he would only have time for one more. He selected the most dangerous from the list, a Chaos Space Marine hiding within the palace's lower reaches. A traitor who had infiltrated Terra decades ago and maintained deep cover through careful discipline. According to the Emperor's intelligence, this warrior served Tsentia, the chaos god of change and scheming. He had been gathering information on the palace's defenses, mapping weak points, identifying potential targets for a major incursion. His presence represented a cancer that would spread catastrophically if left untreated. The Slayer found him in a section of the palace that had been abandoned after structural damage during the Horus Heresy. The traitor had made his lair in a chamber that had once served as a strategic planning room, its walls still bearing scorch marks from battles fought 10,000 years ago. He had been preparing to transmit his gathered intelligence through a carefully shielded Vox channel when the Slayer's presence disrupted the psychic wards he had established. The Chaos Space Marine turned to face his doom with weapons already drawn. He was Thousand Suns, his armor bearing the arcane symbols of Tsentia's chosen legion. Sorcerous energy crackled around his form, years of careful study channeled into combat applications that could shatter squads of normal warriors. He had survived the long war against the Imperium through cunning and power applied in precise measure. He would not go down easily. So, the traitor spoke, his voice distorted by his helmet's Vox grill. The Emperor's new weapon finds me at last. I wondered how long his blindness would persist. You are not of this reality, stranger. I sense the dimensional taint upon you. What bargain brought you to Terra? What price did you agree to pay? The Slayer did not answer with words. His response came in the form of the heavy cannon, drawn and aimed in a single fluid motion. The traitor's eyes widened behind his helmet lenses as he recognized the weapon's unusual design, its mechanisms unlike anything Imperial or Chaos. He began to weave a defensive spell, warp energies forming barriers between himself and the Slayer. Too slow. The heavy cannon fired, and the traitor's barriers shattered under the kinetic impact. The Chaos Space Marine staggered backward, his armor's integrity compromised, blood leaking from the crater in his breastplate. But Thousand Suns were resilient in ways that transcended mere flesh. His consciousness, bound to his armor through sorcerous rituals, refused to disperse even as his body failed. He gathered power for a final curse, determined to inflict some cost on the warrior who had ended his long mission. The Slayer closed the distance before the spell completed. His fist hammered into the traitor's helmet with force sufficient to shatter ceramite and pulp augmented bone. The Chaos Space Marine's consciousness fragmented, unable to maintain cohesion as his physical anchor was destroyed. Tsentia's influence, which had sustained him through decades of isolation and danger, retreated as its investment proved worthless. The traitor fell, truly dead for the first time since his transformation into a Thousand Sun sorcerer millennia ago. The Slayer destroyed the traitor's communication equipment and the intelligence he had gathered, ensuring the information could not fall into other hands. Then he set his final explosive, this one configured to create an implosion that would crush everything in the chamber to powder. No trace of the traitor's presence would remain, no evidence that could be studied or replicated. When the Imperium's forces finally investigated this section of the palace, they would find only an empty chamber with inexplicable damage. He felt the dimensional breach beginning its final collapse, reality growing more insistent about ejecting his presence. The sensation was familiar, a pulling at the edges of his being that would soon become irresistible. He had perhaps minutes remaining in this dimension. He used that time to return to the throne chamber, to stand once more before the Golden Throne and offer a final acknowledgement to the Emperor whose strength he had tested and confirmed. The Emperor's consciousness touched his own one last time, a brief contact carrying gratitude and respect. You have served humanity well in your short time here, warrior. The corruption you have destroyed would have grown to threaten millions. Your judgment was precise, your execution flawless. I thank you, and I ask you to carry this message forward to whatever dimensions you visit next. Tell them that terror still stands. Tell them that the Emperor endures. Tell them that humanity fights on, no matter the cost, no matter the corruption arrayed against us. We will not fall while warriors such as yourself still walk the universe. The Slayer nodded his acceptance of this burden. He would carry the Emperor's message, though he could not guarantee when or where he would have opportunity to deliver it. His path between dimensions followed no logic he could discern, no pattern he could predict. But perhaps, in some future dimension, he would encounter beings who needed to hear that humanity survived in at least one reality. That somewhere, someone still held the line against darkness. The breach seized him then, argent energy flooding his systems as reality ejected him with gathering force. The throne chamber dissolved into cascading light. The Emperor's presence faded, the weight of terror's psychic pressure vanished. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the Slayer existed between dimensions, suspended in the space where realities brushed against each other without touching. Then the light faded, the sensation of motion ceased, and he found himself standing on familiar ground. Hell's surface stretched before him, the same endless battlefield he had left what felt like hours but might have been seconds ago. Demons assembled in the distance, their formations preparing for renewed assault. The icon of sin loomed on the horizon, its reality-warping presence, a challenge that demanded his attention. He was home, if hell could be called home to one who existed to destroy it. The war continued, eternal and unchanging, the only certainty in a multiverse of chaos, but something had changed within him. The test he had administered to the Emperor, the judgment he had rendered, had clarified his own purpose in ways he had not anticipated. He was not merely a destroyer of demons. He was a guardian of those who fought corruption, a validator of worthy resistance. His fury existed not for its own sake but in service to a principle. As long as beings like the Emperor continued fighting with strength and discipline, as long as they held the line against corruption despite contamination, they deserved to stand. The Slayer loaded his super shotgun and began walking toward the demon formations. They saw him coming and roared their challenge, eager to test themselves against the warrior who had destroyed so many of their kind. They did not know he had just returned from testing a god. They did not know their own supremacy had been called into question by a being mightier than any demon lord. They would learn these truths soon enough, written in the language he spoke most fluently, the language of absolute, uncompromising judgment. Behind him, in a dimension he would likely never visit again, the Emperor returned his full attention to maintaining the Astronomicon. The test had drained him significantly, pushing his damaged body closer to final failure. But it had also confirmed something he had long suspected. He was not alone in his eternal vigil. Other warriors existed across the multiverse, each fighting their own battles against corruption, each holding their own lines, each bearing burdens that would crush lesser beings. And occasionally, when the dimensional barriers grew thin enough, these warriors touched each other's realities, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, always as mirrors reflecting the same fundamental truth, that the fight against corruption required strength, discipline, and willingness to bear contamination without surrendering to it. That purity was not absence of taint but resistance to it. That the greatest warriors were not those who avoided darkness but those who walked through it without being consumed. The Emperor had been tested and found worthy. The Imperium would continue, sustained by his sacrifice and the millions of others who fought alongside him in ways large and small. The corruption would press against them constantly, seeking weakness, exploiting doubt, but they would endure, as they had endured for 10,000 years, because they possessed the will to do so. In the throne chamber, Valorian stood with his remaining custodians and contemplated what they had witnessed. A warrior from beyond reality had challenged the Emperor and declared him worthy to continue. A being capable of slaughtering custodians with contemptuous ease had chosen to spare the master of mankind after testing his strength. What did this mean for the Imperium? What did it say about their master's nature, that corruption existed within him but remained controlled? Captain General, one of his subordinates spoke quietly. Should we report this encounter to the High Lords? Should we inform the Inquisition that the Emperor harbors chaos taint? Valorian considered carefully before answering. The truth was dangerous, potentially catastrophic if it spread beyond those who could understand its context. But lying served no purpose. The Emperor had openly acknowledged the corruption within himself, had fought to prove he controlled it rather than being controlled by it. That truth deserved to stand, regardless of how others might interpret it. We report it exactly as it occurred, Valorian decided. The Emperor faces constant exposure to chaos through his vigil. That some taint has penetrated his defenses is inevitable, but he maintains absolute control over it, containing the corruption through strength of will that surpasses any daemon's power. Today, a warrior from beyond our reality tested that control and declared it sufficient. This is not weakness, this is the price of standing watch against forces that would consume us all. Anyone who cannot understand this distinction has no place in the inner circles of power. His custodians nodded their understanding. They would craft their reports carefully, emphasizing the Emperor's continued dominance over the corruption rather than the corruption's presence. They would frame the encounter as validation of their master's strength rather than revelation of his vulnerability. The truth would be preserved, but it would be presented in ways that served the Imperium rather than undermining it. Across Terra, in the shadows and the depths, those who served corruption felt a disturbance in their carefully maintained networks. Multiple cells had gone silent simultaneously. Sanctuaries had collapsed. Cultists had vanished. A pressure had been applied to Terra's underworld, brief but devastating, removing corruption with surgical precision. They did not know what had caused this sudden purge, but they knew its effects would ripple through their operations for decades. Some interpreted it as the Emperor's work. His attention briefly focused on internal threats. Others suspected the Inquisition had received intelligence of unusual accuracy. A few, those with deeper connections to the warp, sensed something else entirely. A presence that had moved through Terra like judgment incarnate, identifying and destroying corruption with efficiency that surpassed even the mightiest inquisitorial operations. They whispered about it in encrypted communications, trading theories and warnings. A new player had entered the game, they said. A force that served neither Emperor nor Chaos, that answered to no authority they recognized. It had come, it had killed, it had departed, but the memory of its passage remained, a reminder that even in Terra's depths, even in sanctuaries carefully hidden through decades of effort, nothing was safe from beings that existed beyond normal limitations. They were right to fear. Though the Slayer had departed this dimension, his actions had consequences that would echo through years to come. The cults he destroyed would take time to rebuild, creating gaps in Chaos's networks that weakened their overall position. The traitor he eliminated had been gathering intelligence for a major operation, information now lost and unrecoverable. The Emperor's positions had been strengthened, his internal enemies reduced, his strategic situation improved. And perhaps most importantly, those who fought for the Imperium now knew that forces existed beyond their reality that stood against corruption, that the Emperor's war was not fought alone, even across dimensional boundaries, that somewhere in the infinite complexity of the multiverse, warriors existed who shared their purpose and would test their worth without mercy. This knowledge would sustain them through the dark times ahead, when corruption pressed harder and the Imperium's resources stretched thinner than ever. But these consequences unfolded in the Slayer's absence, rippling across Terra and beyond, while he fought battles in other dimensions. He did not see the impact of his brief intervention. He did not witness the renewed determination his actions inspired in those who learned of them. He simply continued his eternal war, moving from battlefield to battlefield, dimension to dimension, bringing judgment to corruption wherever it dared to take root. In hell, the demons fell before him, as they always had. In dimensions beyond counting, entities that threatened innocent lives discovered the cost of their actions, and occasionally, when dimensional barriers grew thin enough, he would be pulled through breaches into realities where his skills were needed most, where corruption had grown strong enough to threaten entire civilizations, where warriors stood against impossible odds and wondered if anyone cared about their struggles. He cared, His fury cared, his judgment cared, and when he arrived in those realities, pulled by forces beyond his control or understanding, he made certain they knew it, through violence rendered with surgical precision, through corruption destroyed without hesitation, through tests administered to the mightiest defenders, challenging them to prove their worth or fall to one who would not accept anything less than absolute resistance to darkness. This was his purpose, this was his burden. This was the war he had chosen to fight across infinity itself, and he would continue fighting until corruption ceased to exist or he finally fell in battle against something stronger than himself. Whichever came first, whenever that moment arrived, he would face it the same way he faced everything else, with fury, with precision, with absolute, uncompromising commitment to the principle that corruption must be destroyed, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences, no matter who stood in his way. The Emperor understood this principle, Terra's defenders understood it, and now, across the dimensional boundaries, word would spread through channels unknown and unknowable. The Doomslayer walks between worlds. He tests the worthy and destroys the corrupted. He answers to no authority except his own purpose. And when he arrives in your reality, judgment arrives with him. Be strong enough to pass his test, or be annihilated with the corruption you harbor. There is no third option. There never was.